Hello, my name is Tim Rockwell and I'm the chairman of the Energy and Utilities Business Committee at the British Chamber of Commerce in Singapore. Welcome many of you to our webcast. We've been delighted with the attendance to this, and we're hoping for a very interactive session. So please get ready with your Q&A, which you can ask the panelists through the chat box. So this is our event. We have done a lot of events on Road to Net Zero. That's one of the key campaigns of the Chamber this year as we lead up to COP26, which is being hosted in the UK in November 2021. So we're over a year away, we're over a year away from that. This webcast will be recorded, and you can see our other recordings as well on the Chamber YouTube channel. I'm going to pass over now to Will. Will is an active member of our committee from the Carbon Trust. The Carbon Trust saddles both the committees that are hosting this event, Energy and Utilities and Sustainability. And I'll let Will introduce the panelists, but let me first just add my own thanks to the panelists, Seth Tan, who's joining us from Infrastructure Asia, Peter Iceberg from Shell, and Peter Godfrey from the Energy Institute. So with that, over to you, Will.
Thank you, Tim. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is William Hudson, and I head up the Carbon Trust work in Southeast Asia, based here in Singapore. The Carbon Trust is a sustainability consultancy, and we're specialised in all things low carbon, so that's policy, technology and finance, and we advise a range of different client types, including both governments and the private sector. In terms of circular economy, we work mostly on circular business model innovation, including with corporates, SMEs and startups, and I can talk a bit more about that shortly. So before we get started, a few words on the format for today. So I will be moderating the session, and I will provide a short presentation as a scene setter for today's topic, which is energy and the circular economy. And I'll then hand over to our three expert speakers. And as Tim mentioned, we have Peter Godfrey, who's Managing Director of the Energy Institute here in Singapore, Peter Iceberg, who is Downstream Capital Projects General Manager at Shell, and we have Seth Tan, who is Executive Director of Infrastructure Asia. So each speaker will give up to 10 minutes of introductory comments, and we'll then move to an open discussion for around 20 or 30 minutes, followed by an audience Q&A. So your questions are very welcome. So I'd encourage you to submit them at any time, and we'll do our best to address them at the end. Next slide, please. Great. So in terms of setting the scene, a little bit of context and some comments on trends in circular economy at the moment. So as most of you know, business as usual, which is the means of business or means of doing business that we're most familiar with, is typically predicated on a broadly linear model, which involves resource extraction, resource use, and then disposal of waste. So this model works well in a resource abundant world, and it works well in one in which social and environmental externalities are not priced and where the polluter does not need to pay. However, we know that we now no longer live in a world where resources exist in such abundance, and we also know that the global population is expected to peak at around 9 to 11 billion people later this century. But more importantly, we know that we'll be adding around 2.5 billion people to the middle class over the next 20 years. So as countries develop, pressure on commodities because of resource consumption will significantly increase. We've already seen a commodities boom throughout the early 2000s. And while prices have softened more recently, we know that the macro trend overall is upwards. So not only are prices increasing, but we're seeing countries exhibiting protectionism over the finite resources that they control. And that is an increasing problem for global supply chains. So what does this mean for businesses? It means that they need to adapt. And while they do need to work with governments when it comes to resource supply, this is not necessarily something they can control. But what they can control is their business models. So capturing and preserving the value of their products for as long as possible and putting materials back through the value chain where possible is now not just about risk avoidance in terms of resource depletion, but it's also a significant opportunity. And businesses that are resource intensive will be at the forefront when it comes to this adapting and bringing forward new business models. but there's also a great opportunity for service companies to help them. So for example, through ICT, communications and better data, so things like moving goods around more efficiently, promoting cross-business collaboration and linking up the supply chain are all things that can be assisted with better data and new services. So just to wrap up with an example, so an example of a company that has adopted circular economy principles and innovation is Caterpillar. So they have a remanufacturing model whereby they take back their machines at the end of life and they remanufacture them. They put on new warranties and they then sell them back. So essentially material is not lost at the end of life. The customer gets a new product and Caterpillar can produce at a much lower cost for around 80% less energy and carbon. So it's a win-win for all involved. And in summary, circularity can be a key enabler of new business models. And according to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, a circular economy is restorative and regenerative by design, and it aims to keep products, components and materials at their highest utility and value at all times. Next slide, please. So to look at the energy sector in particular, just a few examples of circular economy opportunities, which I've split into three broad areas. So upstream, so that's to do with extraction and production, use, so that's to do really with efficient utilization of assets, and then downstream, which is more around end of cycle, end of asset life. So firstly, looking at extractive, so in terms of using fossil as a fuel, this is inherently non-circular as you're using a non-renewable resource where the waste product cannot be recycled into further fuel. But there are some good opportunities when it comes to recycling, remanufacturing products that are made from extractives more broadly, so including in plastics and chemicals, metals such as copper, and even composites, which may exist further down the value chain. So more broadly, as the world looks to energy transition with a significant shift to renewable energy and new energy systems, we're going to need to identify ways to minimize the resources needed for new technologies, as well as making manufacturing more modular to assist with material recovery. So a couple of examples are sort of rare earth metals for wind turbines and other precious metals for solar PV. Secondly, looking at efficient utilization of assets. So energy efficiency itself remains a relatively untapped opportunity across the ASEAN region. And there are established barriers to proven energy efficiency technologies, which include lack of awareness, lack of capacity and skills, and lack of finance. And better data is also needed across both private and public sectors to fully harness these opportunities. It's also essential to make sure that systems are appropriately sized, so matching supply and demand wherever possible. And things like breakthroughs in battery technology are increasingly making this possible. And also supporting assets with strong operations and maintenance is a good way of delivering optimal asset performance and uptime. Finally, looking at end of life. So as I mentioned, there are great opportunities to make assets modular so that they can be broken down for recycling and recovery at end of life. And this is increasingly being incentivized by stronger regulation. So for example, in the EU, there will be real costs to producers contributing to unnecessary wastage going forward. Where recovery is not possible, there are good opportunities to improve disposal, so things like waste to energy, which is not a circular concept in itself, but may be a useful means of preventing wider pollution. And also things like capturing landfill gas are good opportunities across ASEAN. So we look forward to hearing more from our speakers on all of these ideas and more. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just to wrap up, I just wanted to touch on some of the support that Carbon Trust can offer when it comes to business model innovation, including for circular economy. So we're supporting organisations in three main areas, which we call enable, accelerate, transform. So enable is about defining your purpose, your ambition, your focus innovation areas. Accelerate is around developing and validating new and investable business models. And transform is about achieving scale through both targeted support and financing. Next slide, please. And when it comes to circular economy, we have an established practical process for identifying strengths and weaknesses in your existing business model, as well as key trends and opportunities for becoming circular. And we can help develop models based on these circular principles, including roadmaps and steps for implementation. So any questions on any of the above, please feel free to submit a question, or you can email us with a contact address in the bottom right there. That's all from me. We'll move into the main session now, and I'll hand over to our first speaker, Peter Godfrey, who is Managing Director at the Energy Institute. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Will. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon from Singapore, and good morning to those of you joining from Europe. Before giving my introductory presentation, may I clearly state that the comments that I shall be making today are entirely personal, based on my own thoughts and experiences gained during a far too long career in the energy sector, both conventional and unconventionally, and in more recent years, increasingly focused on energy and transition and sustainability issues. I make no apology for what may appear to be fairly radical statement at times during my session. Next slide, please, Sabina. The COVID-19 crisis and the political, economic, and social disruptions it has caused have exposed fundamental inadequacies of our current economic systems. Amid global concern for lives, livelihoods, and the planet, leaders find themselves at a historic crossroads for shaping the recovery, and are challenged to reset economies on a new trajectory of more inclusive and sustainable growth. The unsustainable use of resources has triggered critical scarcities and caused climate change and widespread environmental degradation, all of which have negative impacts on our well-being of the planet, and well-being of obviously the people on the planet, as well as the animals and the livestock. At the same time, more than 10% of world population continues to live in extreme poverty, unable to meet even their most basic needs. Responding to this dual challenge will require innovative policies, redirected investment, environmentally sound technologies, international cooperation, and capacity development to support countries to transition towards a green and more inclusive growth and economy. Producers will need to change how they design, source, manufacture, market, and sell products, and consumers will need to incorporate environmental and social concerns into their consumption decisions and adopt sustainable lifestyles. This has far-reaching consequences for the energy sector and related infrastructure development. Resilience and sustainable development will increasingly resonate from the halls of power through to all of us as producers and consumers, with the so-called circular economy underpinning much of this rhetoric. Within this context, I see the circular economy not only as a broad concept that relates to reduction and recycling of waste, but policy that will increasingly drive policy creation of a new economic order based on 4 key principles. Those being resource efficiency, not just energy efficiency, which will play a fundamental role in underpinning political policy and strategy. And this will lead to a focus on so-called green or sustainable procurement, whereby what we produce and consume and how we consume it, both in terms of the supply chain and the post-consumption value chain, will both come under far greater scrutiny than they have ever been before. The second one is collaborative enterprise. What we will see is a fundamental change in the structure of today's businesses and business ecosystems, and greater productive integration in ways that we haven't even seen yet. The third is we will see new forms of cooperation, local, regional, national, multinational, that will happen. And finally, we will see multilateralism continue, but in a very different way to the way that we've seen it basically focused in the past, much more towards sustainability, the green agenda, the Paris Agreement, climate change, etc. So what I'm saying is that a combination of new and more integrated technology solutions, policy support reinforced by fundamental societal change, have the power to close the emissions gap and create a much more clean energy future if we're beginning to start looking at the energy sector. Next slide, please. Will mentioned Europe, and I'd like to start my conversation here with Europe because Europe has actually fundamentally begun to change their vision towards a circular vision for the policy that they are putting in place. And actually only last March, they created a set of policies with 4 key themes identified as being the ones that they would actually see as policy plans for the future. One being a sustainable product policy, which will actually put laws in place, which will effectively make the EU no longer using items or products or raw materials that are not easy to reuse, repair, and recycle. And they will be taxing and beginning to tax those products that are unable to meet those sustainable product design bases. The second is they are going to increasingly begin to start communicating with the consumer of all products, whether it's at wholesale or retail level, with a view to creating new reforms aimed at proposing stronger laws against greenwashing, against premature obsolescence, and actually labeling and making tools in place to encourage consumers to take on a very new way of life, a bit like the Europeans did at the beginning of the anti-smoking ban many, many years ago. The third one is they will be introducing a set of regulations and laws around the whole concept of circularity in production processes, whether it be the chemicals industry, whether it be the upstream oil and gas industry, or other producing industries. All industries will have to do much more in terms of tracking, tracing, and mapping their resources and how they are used within their internal production processes. And then fourth and finally comes waste reduction. Next slide, please. So as can be seen, the Europeans are going very much into a stage where they're looking at setting down a set of laws and regulations. They're going to focus on 6 core sectors initially. That doesn't mean that other sectors will not be looked at, but the sectors that they're focusing in on are consumer electronics, packaging, plastics, textiles, construction, and food services, all of which will aim by 2021 already to have an initial set of regulations and white papers in place that will basically underpin the slide that I showed before. Next slide, please. Next slide, thank you very much. So before we go on to the concept of circular economy, I mentioned in a slide before last this whole concept of green and sustainable procurement. And to my mind, one of the key messages that I'd like you to leave with is a message around the fact that when people talk about circular economy, they genuinely talk more about waste and waste recycling. I actually believe that circular economy is more about procurement and the way we buy things and use things in addition to the waste and recycling issue. So effectively, sustainable procurement, and this is also set within the terms of the European mandate, is going to be a major policy that is also worked at by the Europeans in order to encourage all companies, all business, to effectively develop green procurement policies, sustainable procurement policies, and begin to introduce taxation, and if necessary, some incentive, but mainly taxation, if companies are not capable of achieving sustainable and green procurement aims. This will require a new degree of transparency. It will need a new way of looking at the world, of the way we run business, and coming back to Will's piece on how we go about looking at new business processes will require a whole new concept of the way we re-engineer our business. But it's not all about cost. The Europeans have done quite a lot of studies in this area, and they have come up with the fact that if you look at employment, if you look at re-engineering businesses along the lines of sustainability, this is not just a cost issue, it's actually a benefit issue. That actually you can create value out of the circular economy, and by creating a more innovative management system and a market-based system that is focused on the circular economy, one can actually do a value-add equation rather than a cost equation that hurts everybody. What it requires, however, is a somewhat different policy and a somewhat different way of looking at what constitutes value in the various businesses that we operate. Next slide, please, Sabina. Now, tied in with this is this very important dilemma that I think is also part of the supply chain issue that we have faced today, and it's going to change tomorrow. As we all know, in past, the focus was very much on business agility, very much on just-in-time supply chains, very much looking at fast, quick delivery items. Well, the COVID-19 dilemma has made governments and people throughout the world think about the fact that maybe we need to actually store more stuff. Maybe we need to be more concerned about what the contingencies that we require in our supply chains are likely to be, what we actually grow, develop, energize locally as opposed to internationally. So what we will begin to start seeing is a very different change in the model, not only in terms of the way we look at the supply chain from a sustainability point of view, but also from the point of view of how we re-engineer the supply chain to be more in line with where we think we want to go. And this brings me to a key point within the energy sector, which I think has been missed by a lot of countries and even companies around the world. I call it the deglobalization of energy. If we look at the energy industry over the past 100 years, whether we look at coal, oil and gas, hydrocarbons industry generally, it has been driven by a concept of a global energy commodity. Oil is a global commodity. LNG is increasingly a globalized commodity. Well, the difference we see within the energy sector now is that actually the solutions that Asia have, different countries in Asia, not just the region, the solutions that Europe will have, the solutions that the United States will have, will all be different. And they'll be different because actually we have different resources at our disposal. So we will begin to start seeing the energy model breaking down from a globalized commodity-based model to something that is much more regionally and locally focused. And I think people are missing that, but it's very core to recognize that that will be part of what re-engineering business structure will look like in the future. And finally, within this context, we should also recognize that the human dimension is returning. It will play a prime role in rebalancing the global supply chain as we recover from the pandemic and well beyond. As unemployment rates rise across the world, healthcare and agriculture industries will all require to re-employ people. So actually this localization will also be increasingly be recommended and advised by many governments who will want to rebuild their capability for employment and their own strategic specialities. Next slide, please. So what does all this mean? You know, I'm not a politician, and you know, some people, as I said right at the beginning, could argue that the whole capitalistic model is bust. We're going to see the end of capitalism, and indeed, I put a number of quotes up here that states that capitalism is really in a bit of a mess, and there is a need for fundamental political change. A recent landmark study written by scientists from Australia, Switzerland, and the UK, published very recently in the Nature Communications magazine, said that it is clear that current prevailing capitalist growth-driven economic systems have not only increased affluence since World War II, but have led to enormous increases in inequality, financial instability, resource consumption, and environmental pressures on the vital earth support systems we live in today. The paper notes that the richest 10% of people in the world are responsible for up to 43% of destructive global environmental impact. In contrast, the poorest 10% in the world are responsible for just 5% of these environmental impacts. So whether we like it or not, it fundamentally confirms that the global structural inequalities and the distribution of wealth that we have in place today has to begin to fundamentally change. Next slide and final slide, please, Sabina. That will happen basically as a result of rethinking business structure. And rethinking business structure will be an issue that not only takes our old economies and profits into account, but increasingly adds the values of environmental and social issues into that debate. It will also begin to start including the issues on the right-hand side, whereby society, the environment, quality of life will increasingly play a part in the way we value our projects of tomorrow. So we're at the beginning of a journey, and I'll leave it there. There's a lot to talk about within this context, but within the circular economy, that is where I believe the world will go. And increasingly a world that is integrated, where the actual resources that we use, such as energy, water, and waste, will become much more closely interconnected in terms of the way we design ecosystems in the future. I know Seth will talk about TUAS very soon, which is a very good example of just this new form of integration that is beginning to happen. And I believe that is the fundamental way we will see the energy sector and its related infrastructure develop in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. So it's very interesting to hear your comments around the trend towards deglobalization of energy and making things more regionally and locally focused. And I think these lessons from the EU and learning about what the EU is doing is very interesting for ASEAN. And I agree, rethinking business structures is something that a lot of work needs to be done there as well. So handing now over to Peter Iceberg from Shell. So Peter has a long history with Shell across various areas, mostly downstream, so chemicals, technologies, innovation, and latterly in process technologies and capital projects. So I'll let Peter introduce himself. Thank you, Peter, over to you.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon from the Netherlands. So my name is indeed Peter Reisberg. I'm currently heading in Shell Global Solutions a team of so-called front-end development managers for capital projects that basically mature initial idea to a level that we can take a final investment decision on. And that could mean maturing the technology to something which can be deployed, or it could also mean maturing the business case that will support the investment. What I would like to do in my slot is basically share 3 examples that relate to today's theme. One of them is in the Netherlands and was in the press a while ago. It's about the use of green hydrogen and with potential use for mobility, but also in carbon capture and utilization. The reason I want to mention it as an example, as it shows how many players do need to be involved to make something like this happen. The green hydrogen is produced in an electrolyzer complex. This would be a 200 megawatt complex, which is basically the largest ever built at the moment. In the future, probably there will be much larger ones, but currently that's one challenge. The actual green electricity will come from a wind farm, which is currently being bid, and Shell and Eneco, which is a power company in the Netherlands, are bidding as a joint venture, Crosswind, for this wind farm, which is 750 megawatts. So about a third of the electricity coming from that wind farm would be used for producing the hydrogen. The wind farm to be built in the North Sea, and power cables from the wind farm would land at the Maasvlakte, which is basically an industrial estate on the far west element of the Netherlands. And the government has plans to basically open a piece of that area for large-scale hydrogen generation to the size of probably 2 to 3 gigawatts, because all of the North Sea wind cables are landing in that area. So the Port of Rotterdam, who basically owns that estate, is playing a key role in facilitating the availability of land, but also in the pipeline connections from the electrolyzer complex to the refinery area. Because the current intent of the green hydrogen is to use it to kickstart hydrogen for mobility, but that's a typical chicken and the egg discussion. The mobility will not start before the infrastructure is there, and you cannot justify the infrastructure without customers. So what we're doing is basically using the green hydrogen in the existing refinery to replace hydrogen made by conventional hydrogen manufacturing units, and basically to some extent for conventional fuels, but also to use in a process to produce lubricants. So the chain: wind producing green electricity, producing green hydrogen, producing molecules from CO2, both captures CO2 emission problems, but it also kickstarts the use of the green hydrogen for other recycle options in refineries. But the message is, you have to invent a business model that kickstarts the first deployment of this cycle. A second example is already used in Singapore by Neste, is basically producing biofuels from recycled vegetable oils like used cooking oil or tallow, maybe also palm oil waste and some virgin materials. Neste built fully new facilities in Singapore to do that. But existing refineries can consider to retask some of their units when actually they will be reducing crude intake over time. Linking to Peter's story, collection of used cooking oils and tallow is very much a regional activity, as the sources are well spread over certain regions. It also means that logistics therefore play an enormous important role in there. And as biofuels are basically sold to solve a CO2 problem, it's very important that logistics are optimized in such a way that you try to minimize the amount of CO2 you emit as part of the collection of the feedstocks. So the control of the so-called carbon intensity of the biofuels is quite important. The third example I'd like to mention is plastic waste to chemicals. Shell is a founding member of the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, and has announced that since about a year, we are now started the process in our US steam cracker to feed so-called pyrolysis oil to replace some conventional feeds in that steam cracker. Again, the chain to arrive there starts with waste, then separation of plastic waste from the rest of the waste, then separation of certain type of plastics, feeding that tranche into something which is called the pyrolysis unit, that then produces pyrolysis oil. Pyrolysis oil is relatively easy shippable and can be transported to a steam cracker, which then produces the usual valuable products from that material. As I mentioned, in the US, we're starting to do that with small quantities. But we have an ambition to process about 1 million ton per annum spread over 3 regions in the world, in the US, in the Netherlands, and also in the East. Logistically, again, quite important to optimize, because the process of producing the suitable pyrolysis oil in the end also produces a waste stream which can find its way in the normal way of processing waste. So I noted the question in the Q&A box. Actually, recycled use of materials can go very well together with conventional incineration of waste. As you will still need some of that in order to make the value chain work. In all these 3 examples, the integration of chemicals and refining complexes play a role. In each of the 3 examples, there is always a stream which can either be processed in existing refining facilities or existing chemicals facilities, but until now wasn't. So the actual change of the feedstock models can be run in parallel to existing operation, and in the end can take over in the level of importance of the existing operations over time. Let me pause there and hand it back.
Thank you very much, Peter. A really, really helpful example. So you talked about the green hydrogen example, the cooking oil example from Nestle, and then the other plastic waste to chemicals example. So yeah, all really interesting, useful examples of how circular economy can be applicable in new business models. So moving now to our final speaker, so Seth Tan from Infrastructure Asia, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, William, and good afternoon to everyone, and good morning to those who dialed in from Europe. I'm Seth Tan, and I would like to split my slot into 2 parts. For those who do not know us, I'd like to make a short introduction in the context of what we are discussing today, and then I'll mention 3 ideas, and hopefully that will be interesting to you. Infrastructure Asia is a project facilitation office that tries to, in particular, help the Singapore-based companies and institutions win in regional infrastructure. And the newer solutions, including in sustainable infrastructure, are very, very important topics that we are trying to help because these are very relevant topics. Next slide, please. But I want to set the stage that the one important point about ASEAN is that not a lot, compared to UK or other OECD countries, not a lot of infrastructure is private sector ready or international private sector ready. Some say only about 10%. Of course, in the context of a very big market requiring $210 billion of new infrastructure every single year, that's still a meaningful number, 10%. But that means that compared to other more developed markets, private sector can play a big part. But the problem is how to make more infrastructure bankable from some of its marginally bankable states at the current phase. And I think Infrastructure Asia is trying to do our bit by trying to combine different offerings, newer approaches, and newer partners. And multilateral development banks play a big part because they can go in with knowledge sharing and also better preparation and also better solutions to catalyze private sector. Private sector companies, many of them have very good solutions. Some of them are based in Singapore, and some of you I've interacted with you before, and they bring good offerings. And public sector agencies' journeys is also important. So to the extent that we can, we try to staple different solutions together in order to make each solution more internationally private sector ready. And to do that, partnerships is important. Next slide, please. So we have signed, since we were set up 2 years ago, various partnerships with the World Bank Group, with even government of Canada, with local institutions like PTSMI from Indonesia, but also with many, many others. I think these formal relationships help us bring good collaborators to showcase what are the newer approaches. But these are not the only partners we have. We have about 500 partners in the infrastructure ecosystem, some newer pockets of financing in the investment world, in blended finance, etc. I think that hopefully helps bring newer combinations to deliver sustainable infrastructure. Next slide, please. And how to chip away. I think it is important to find counterparts with a series of opportunities, willing counterparts who are serious about looking for international solutions. You can have all the good ideas about circular economy, but if your counterpart in the region is not receptive, I think it doesn't go very far. So first of all, finding willing counterparts are very, very important, but also counterparts with a series of opportunities. That's why we recently, Infrastructure Asia, we signed up an MOU, a collaboration agreement with the Ministry of Planning, Finance and Industry in Myanmar, because they are very serious about prioritizing the projects that are important for Myanmar. And in particular, they are also focused on trying to roll out more renewable energy opportunities as part of their COVID-19 economic relief plan. Next slide, please. In the aftermath of COVID, I think this is a very practical lens that we have to adopt. There are some sectors that are going to be more prioritized by the regional government counterparts. Clean energy, fortunately, is one of them, particularly because there's a lot of liquidity in the international space in clean energy. And they are interested to invest and finance clean energy. And in these particular times, it could be a good moment to bring forward more clean energy investments and financing, because governments, because of their efforts to fight the pandemic, a lot of them are fiscally constrained. Next slide, please. But we need to continue to chip away at various aspects. Better project preparation is important in Asia, and hence we have put together an exercise to update what World Economic Forum has done in the past in terms of what are the preparation facilities, the funding that are available to help better prepare projects. And a lot of them are focused on energy efficiency, on renewable energy, about more than 1/3 of them. But at the end of the day, we need to look at projects, and that's why we are, even in these times where it is not easy to travel or impossible to travel, we are working with regional government counterparts to go back and forth with them in terms of how they could structure their projects in order to be more attractive to the private sector. So bit by bit, our office tries to chip away and make more marginally bankable cases bankable. Next slide, please. It is also important to come up with new approaches, and we are together with our newest MOU partner, Asian Development Bank, ADB. This is the team that focuses on the sovereign side of lending, and together with them, we hope to come up with innovative tools to help catalyze more private sector into sustainable infrastructure, particularly with clean energy in ASEAN. And focusing on newer areas like floating solar is also very important. And we recently held together with a series, the Solar Energy Research Institute in Singapore, on floating solar, and that garnered a lot of interest because it precisely countries are looking for newer solutions like floating solars, whether on the reservoir or on the even on the seabed. But very importantly, the last point I want to mention is how do we chip away is capacity building. And hopefully that will be picked up in the Q&A as well, because capacity building allows regional government counterparts to better familiarize with the ideas that they need to adopt in order to create more enabling environments and more bankable projects that will attract international private sector and move that 10% slowly, 11, 12, or maybe in the Western world, it's 50 to 60% of private sector involvement in infrastructure. Given where we are in Asia broadly and in ASEAN, I think chipping away does help. So with that context, I like to talk about 3 ideas. We'll stay on this slide because my subsequent 3 points, I don't have any slides. But the first idea I wanted to mention to contribute to this discussion is a circular economy in the ASEAN filter. I think very importantly is just to focus on the system and not on singular points in the project value chain, because more and more so regional government counterparts are realizing that it is important to get the system right. I'll give you one example. We are working with one of the government agencies in Ho Chi Minh City, and they recently grouped together 3 districts into one single zone and ran a competition for master planning. And the the winning entrant actually gave very good ideas how to incorporate eco elements. So when you plan it well as a system, there's more likely that it will succeed. I think this is the number 1 idea I wanted to see into this discussion, that it is important to have a good system rather than single projects or singular points that you're trying to solve, particularly in ASEAN where there are many low-hanging fruits. The second point I want to talk about is don't focus just on the end, but focus on all aspects of the chain. I think one very good example is waste to energy. I think that was one of the questions they asked early. In many parts of the ASEAN hinterland, the problems is landfill. So if you adopt, when it is suitable, from a technology, from a municipal solid waste composition perspective, it is suitable to adopt incineration, for example. Just adopting waste to energy reduces the rubbish down to 10% or even less that you need to send to the landfill. So all of a sudden, you reduce your end problem by reducing your problem, by working on the earlier aspects of the problem. So waste to energy is one very good example. But of course, not everything is as simple. There are also cultural issues, like when Singapore wanted to adopt new water, there was also a bit of a cultural familiarity. I think it is a very good idea to recycle water, but how do you get the population to adapt? So the tipping point is very important. I think one of the ways we learned ourselves is that perhaps you can send the the recycled water first to industry. And when that gets accepted and when that gets familiarized, then it becomes more easily acceptable by the general population. And of course, in the meantime, you have a business model, which is very important to involve private sector. The last aspect I wanted to talk about is adapting to local situations. It is very important to look at ASEAN as a very big market, 650 million people, fairly young population, growing working class, growing middle class, hence lots of opportunities in infrastructure, including in sustainable infrastructure or infrastructure relating to the circular economy. But each country is different, hence the adoption point is different. For Singapore, as Peter Godfrey mentioned, we are now journeying to our next phase in terms of circular economy. We are trying to develop Tuas Nexus, which combines integrated waste management facility with a water reclamation plant. But we have before that gone through our journey on waste to energy. And I think those journeys are important, and each country is going through different journeys, different tipping points. And even just combining the different facilities can yield significant results. Like for example, if you look away from the Tuas Nexus and look at, for example, our 5th desalination plant, it combines with the Tembusu multi-utilities complex to drive better synergies in terms of resource use. And within ASEAN, there are even lower hanging fruits. So it is important to have good fitting ideas that fits the then tipping point for each of the ASEAN economies and projects that you are looking at. And more importantly, on the positive side is technology can help a lot. Technology is an enabler in today's context, and I'll encourage everyone to look a little bit more at the use of technology. Sometimes it is not expensive at all where technology is. Better use of data can improve O&M and hence can improve the reuse and also the reduction of a resource wastage, even at the upfront planning stage. So I just wanted to drop these few ideas. Hopefully they are interesting to you. Back to you, Will.
Thank you very much, Seth. Really great comments. I particularly enjoyed listening to your comment around focusing on the system and not single points in the project value chain when developing a project. And you use the example of grouping 3 districts into a single zone. So master planning is a system, and more likely that you might succeed in that way. So yeah, really great insight there. So we'll move now to a broader discussion for around 20 minutes or so before we move to the audience Q&A. So I'll just kick off with an initial question. I'm going to target this question firstly at Peter Iceberg from Shell. So the question is around some of these opportunities that you've described. So you mentioned your 3 examples, Peter, and you mentioned using waste streams to substitute for existing streams in terms of refining, and you mentioned pyrolysis units, etc. But you mentioned that in sourcing those waste streams, there can be a logistics issue, and if you don't get that right, then you can end up increasing your emissions effectively. So can you talk to me about, or talk a little bit more about that logistics challenge and how you can overcome that?
Sure, can do. Let's take the biodiesel, biojet option as an example. The production of biofuels is developing with a reasonable speed, because especially in Europe and in US California, there is quite an incentive to sell those molecules and basically getting a CO2 discount, which is a function of the carbon intensity of the molecules. Now, what is carbon intensity? That is basically a certified let's say grams of CO2 per megajoule of energy which this product will produce, but it's the collection of its origin and the transport and let's say chemical operations you have to do to make it suitable for the final market. One element is that these vegetable oils have to be so-called hydroprocessed. Basically, you have to treat them with hydrogen to remove the oxygen from it, and also some other nitrogen components. Conventionally, hydrogen is produced from naphtha or from methane, but with a high amount of CO2 byproduct. So here you are harvesting your precious used cooking oils, but then emitting quite a bit of CO2 when you have to process your hydrogen. So one of the solutions is actually producing that hydrogen in a green way. It could be via green electricity. It could be via using co-produced light ends from hydroprocessing coming from your vegetable oil processing and using that to produce hydrogen. So there are different solutions. Another example is if your facility is, for example, in Europe, and the used cooking oil comes from China, which is a big source of it, it is collected in containers from the different regions. You could consider putting these containers on a ship and then shipping it to Europe. However, container ships have a different CO2 footprint than bulk ships would have. So if you do it wrong, then you actually add CO2 footprint to your feedstocks again, and in the end have a less positive effect when you have your final product. So the trick is probably to transship at the supply source to bulk ships and then get it into your facilities. A very simple example, but it can cost you quite a bit of carbon intensity in the process. Also good to realize is that, and we see this at the moment, at low crude price, the overall upgrade from these waste products to sellable fuels is not great. why is it attractive in Europe and California? Because of the high subsidy levels. But as a business case on its own, it's not enough when the crude is $40 a ton. Let me pause there.
Thank you very much, Peter. Yeah, no, it sounds like an example of a messy stakeholder problem. So, yeah, the need to bring different actors together, not just in that example, but the others that you mentioned, and possibly the use of good data in delivering a carbon optimized solution rather than something that could actually make something worse. So I'm going to hop to Peter Godfrey. So Peter, you mentioned the EU and some of the interesting new policies that are coming through when it comes to circular economy. Do you have any thoughts on which of those policies might be most applicable in ASEAN, and any ways that these lessons can be shared effectively across this region?
I have a view, but whether they'll happen or not is another matter. But let me make some illustrative comments first. Ibu Sri Mulyani, the finance minister of Indonesia, just recently stated that as far as she was concerned, the tax systems in Indonesia, both especially when it comes to taxing the rich, and those that obviously run most of the major conglomerates, is not efficient, both from a collection point of view and from the point of view of actually being progressive. So I guess my first comment really, and we're beginning to start seeing this in the Philippines, it's been in Japan for 2007, 2008, is, as Seth said, right now, infrastructure is in the hands of government, basically, in this part of the world. But what governments need to begin to do is to move from a regressive taxation policy to a more progressive one. We need to tax the right things. And fundamentally, you know, if one is a believer in the circular economy, the fundamental issue around what you tax is resource efficiency, not energy efficiency, resource efficiency, the use of all resources, not just carbon, it's everything, yeah? So again, if one begins to start seeing a move by governments to creating a more resource efficient progressive taxation system, you will begin to start seeing major changes. And we are beginning to see signs of that happening in the Philippines. We're beginning to see signs of it happening in Vietnam, Thailand. Seth mentioned Myanmar. I would say it's at the very early stages, but the train has left the station. And I believe that we will begin to start seeing a move towards that. So that's number one. The second point I would make is this point about localization as opposed to globalization, if you like, is a recognition that when one begins to start looking at renewable energy policies, infrastructure that is needed in remote villages and isolated parts of Asia, and there's a lot of that around, you need a different policy from a centralized government policy. You need to create scale, and you need to create a model that will work on a scaled up solution. So Seth's example of communities getting together and developing a single ecosystem plan instead of looking at their projects independently, I think could make a big difference. So to me, the issue of scaling up projects and developing plans for projects that take that in account will create the right sort of infrastructure and the right sort of appetite to change. I'm sure you're going to ask about financing separately, so we'll talk about financing later, but those would be my two key points, Will.
Thanks, Peter. So building on that, hopping over to Seth. So Peter's talking about scaling up projects and bringing things together. So do you have any other thoughts on what is needed to scale up circular economy, in particular in ASEAN? And you mentioned capacity building.
Yes, I think we need to chip away, but I also like to mention about the lower hanging fruits, because success breeds success. So it is important to start with something that is immediately going to bring recognition by the local internet and hence they'll be more willing to adventure with us to the more sophisticated models, more sophisticated projects. And I'd like to share on 2 points. One is on the user of energy, which is buildings. So many countries have a journey on buildings. From the Singapore ecosystem, we have started our green mark from 2003, 2004. So it has been a good 15, 16 years. And there's a whole ecosystem of how to make buildings more resource efficient, from planning to implementation to operation and maintenance, not just energy efficiency, but the water efficiency and also greening parts of building. And down to the construction phase, 99% of construction waste is recycled as part of this whole ecosystem. So these are very good low-hanging fruits that can be deployed across the whole ASEAN ecosystem. I think this is not the only example, but this example is very promising because everyone has buildings, old as well as new buildings. And buildings, in the case of many countries, are big users of energy. In the case of Singapore, more than 50%. So if we can work on these lower hanging fruits, I think this is a very good start. And it will be very visible. It will show very visible impacts to the government, and they will be more willing to adopt more. And there's so many players, consultants, engineers, designers, and constructors from Singapore as well as UK companies based here that can be involved in that. The other part that I wanted to mention is this is the moment to also have green finance propel green infrastructure, including green buildings. Because if you look at the green finance landscape, 2018, about $4.1 billion of green loans or green finance together was issued. 2019, it almost doubled, 8.1 billion. And 1/3 of the proceeds was used on buildings. So this is an ecosystem where there's a lot of financiers and investors willing to deploy their monies to support green infrastructure, including green buildings. So I think this could be the moment to propel for green finance availability and interest to deploy to propel even the green buildings from being adopted. So I think this is right now a very good sweet spot. And this, I think, if you can start with low-hanging fruits like this, it could propel a lot of interest to adopt others.
Fantastic. Thanks, Seth. So building on that finance point, so in the context of COVID-19, we're hearing a lot about green deals, and we're hearing a lot about stimulus packages. So maybe another one for Peter Godfrey. Do you have any thoughts on how this money can be successfully channeled to circular economy type initiatives and the different types of finance that might be needed?
So I think the answer to the question is all types of finances will be needed. I think increasingly, given post-COVID situation, governments will increasingly be looking at ways and means of improving their public-private participation and partnership. So to my mind, there are lots of opportunities to develop new financing models that could work in a more if you like, productive and forward-looking economy. I think Asian economies generally are still relatively conservative in the way they currently pursue policy. But I think if we begin to start seeing more progressive taxation policies in place, very quickly we will move to a situation where multi-participation models can begin to start making sense. But underpinning of that are, of course, two fundamental issues. I mean, one is that no investor other than perhaps state, and even then it's a question, like to invest in projects unless there's a track record of those projects being successful. So again, the train is out of the station, but a lot of what we're trying to do is new. So actually getting those first past the post projects done is where I think a lot of attention is needed. And I think governments should be prioritizing specific projects to carry out with the idea that we need the first past the post project, because once that project is done, we've created the appetite for the financiers to come around. So that's the number one point. The second point comes back to this issue of having not just one project, but creating a funnel or a pipeline of projects. in the end, not all projects will work. So once you've got a project that works, you then need more than one very quickly in order to make investors comfortable about the idea of investing their money. The more projects there are, the better. So again, the comments that I hear from the private equity guys, from the banks, from everybody, is money's not the problem. The money's here. Our big problem is actually finding the right projects to invest in, because the funnel or the pipelines are not there. So that requires governments, both at the local and the regional, as well as the national level, to really begin to start making those pipelines more visible to the investment community. So to me, those would be the two key points.
Thanks, Peter. Maybe moving back to Seth. So in terms of different investors having different risk appetites and the stimulus funding we're hearing about, do you think there's a good role for government to really kickstart things when it comes to sustainability type projects and circular economy? And how can that government funding maybe be used initially and then phased out for the private sector later?
Okay, I think it depends on the asset class. But if you remember, one of the slides that I presented was some of the key sectors that some of the governments we interacted with have reprioritized in the aftermath of COVID. One of the areas is clean energy. Clean energy, historically, I think it could be 100% private sector finance from the equity and the debt side if you structure it well. So in this case, government just need to create the enabling environment and the enabling policies to make sure that the private sector feels that their investments and their financings are safe over the life of the loan or over the life of the concession. So I think in that extreme, the government does not need to put too much money. But in other sectors like logistics, public health, and also ICT, perhaps the government needs to put the money at the right spots. But the problem is not about money, governments putting money. I think the problem is about the government raising the familiarity of what attracts private sector. So finding the right counterparts who are willing to do it is important. I go back to the point that Peter made, is that for me, it's not only about the financial incentives, but it's also the government's familiarization. Hence, I want to pick up Will's point about capacity building. A lot of what we do is trying to show the government what are the 5 or 6 things that needs to be there in order for private sector to come in. And in today's world, I think a lot of enlightened governments, they will quite quickly figure out that these 5 or 6 things they can adopt or they cannot adopt. For those who can adopt them, I think suddenly they'll have a series of opportunities. And what's missing in ASEAN in particular is that this series of opportunities. That's why a lot of big institutional investors from Canada, for example, or from Australia in the past, they like to look at India and China because those are big markets and in a way more homogeneous. ASEAN is 650 million, but 10 countries. So if we can create a series of opportunities through targeted capacity building, I think this would be quite meaningful.
And just adding, Will, if I may, to Seth's comments about his point about that obviously renewable projects could be private projects now. To my mind, the other key point here is scale. I mean, it's not an issue so much about building a project. It's an issue that if you're building a project in the middle of the jungle, then it's very difficult to make a one-off project work, not from the point of view of building it, but maintaining it. And the issue here is about governments relaxing regulations more and devolving responsibility more to regions and communities to develop their own financially structured models. And that's also about capacity building. So this issue about scaling up at the local regional level is also very much about capacity building, as Seth says. And it's very important to recognize that, I think.
Absolutely. Thanks, Peter. So moving back to Peter Iceberg. So while we're talking about scale and scaling up projects and getting the finance flowing behind those project pipelines, using the examples that you gave, Peter, can you think of any sort of key challenges in scaling up? And for example, with the hydrogen project that you mentioned, it is a complex project which involves many stakeholders. Is that something that would be quite difficult to scale up? Do you have any examples of how you might go about that and how you might access finance for those types of projects?
Yeah, if you take the hydrogen project, the ambition of the Port of Rotterdam is an electrolyzer park of the size of 2 to 3 gigawatts. And they see the current Shell project as a starter in there. Facilities necessary are starting to be scaled up in line with the ambition, but of course they can never be paid by the first project. So the combination of the Dutch government and European Union are playing a role in actually working with quite a high subsidy level to get that infrastructure in place to kickstart it, because otherwise it's not going to work. But maybe the vegetable oil example is also an interesting, or the plastic waste might be even better. Is one of the problems with things like plastic waste is the volume. And basically what you see in a number of projects of this type, you always should attempt to avoid transporting the big volume over a big distance, which naturally leads to having facilities with a radius around 50 to 75 kilometers where you collect your waste and then do a processing step that reduces that volume materially before you make the next step. And that means that you very quickly go into take the plastic waste, that you need some kind of a decentralized combination of units where you collect all types of waste and specifically see the pyrolysis operation of plastic waste as part of that operation before you move the pyrolysis oil to your big steam cracker complexes. And if you look at that, you see that happening already. The size of the pyrolysis units we currently see are like 20 KT per annum, while we're targeting 300 KT of pyrolysis oil into a steam cracker complex, which is basically about 1/6 of the total feed of a world scale cracker, which means I need multiple units of these pyrolysis waste collection systems to actually get it going.
Yeah,
Will, just another point to add on to Peter's, if I may, because I'd like to reinforce his comment about this issue about reverse logistics within waste. And it also covers one of the questions that's on our Q&A session that asked is the waste hierarchy in conflict with the circular economy concept? And I would argue the answer is no, it's not in conflict. What is the problem is precisely what Peter says, which is a lot of energy is being spent on front-end production technology, like oil to fuel, waste to energy. Actually, the biggest problem is the reverse logistics, is how you actually collect the waste, optimize that waste collection into something that can be a scaled-up project. And to my mind, that is also an enormous opportunity that happens as a result of thinking circular and thinking about the circular economy. So I'm just really reinforcing what Peter says in Holland. You know, his problem is less on the, the upstream technology and selling the whatever he is producing at the end. His actual problem is creating a scaled, massive raw material on which to base that technology.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Great. I'm going to go around the table. So does it just basically key takeaways and any final comments, and then we can move to the audience Q&A. So I can see there's a few questions come through, but maybe if we start with you, Seth, any sort of key takeaways for the audience or top tips?
Yeah, I think I've said it all, but I also wanted to add my bit on the waste hierarchy versus waste to energy, if possible. I think it all adds up. Because at the end of the day, we are trying to solve the landfill problem, where many countries in the region, looking from the ASEAN perspective, is trying to solve landfills, or more and more landfills is not sustainable. So waste to energy is the one solution, but upstream management of waste is another solution. Sometimes if you recycle it effectively, you find that there's no need for waste to energy project. I think that's fine. At least you have gone through the whole value chain process and figure out that waste to energy is for the moment not needed. It tends to be for bigger cities anyway. You need a certain amount of rubbish or municipal solid waste, and typically more suitable for growing cities, because you can see the waste likely to go up over time and maybe increasing in calorific value. So your waste to energy becomes more and more important as a project. But I think you have to look at the whole system, which is what I started off with. And that, if you look at it from that perspective, some countries or some cities will find that after the analysis, waste to energy is not suitable for them at that particular moment, and that's fine. But at least they've gone through the analysis. But some find that right sizing becomes important. So you could have potentially a 3,000 tons per day waste to energy, but because if you recycle a bit more, you at the upfront, you end up just needing for the moment 2,000 tons or 1,000 ton waste to energy. I think that is okay. I think this is the kind of system thinking that more and more regional governments need help from all the companies, all the governments who have gone through this journey. I think this is very beneficial.
Great, thanks Seth, thanks. Peter, Godfrey, would you like to add any final comments before we move to Q&A?
Maybe just a thought that apart from waste incineration, we should also include waste gasification in our thinking, because that makes a series of molecules which are the start of another chain to make useful products. And it's a bit more difficult as incineration, but you see it developing. And another thing you see is that more and more fully integrated waste processing is starting to appear, including metals recovery and so on, and maybe some in incineration in the end, but also gasification. So it's basically, there are private players appearing in the market that offer that as a solution. Still, the scale is maybe not where we want it to be, but it's in operation.
Great, over to you, Peter G.
Well, I'd like to come back to the issue of sustainable procurement or green procurement as being probably the most under-headlined issue, but probably the issue that we all ought to be watching more closely than we probably are. I think as a result of COVID-19, as a result of, the fact that everybody is suffering from economic stress, this is the time where I think governments are going to increasingly focus on the issue of green procurement, and within that context, sustainable procurement. I suspect, and this is my crystal ball, that it will become a core agenda item on COP26 next year. And I suspect that we will all be working with governments across the world, not just in Europe, that will be focusing in on what green and sustainable procurement means to their economies, whether we talk about ASEAN countries independently, or possibly even ASEAN countries getting together and having a more joined up discussion around those issues over the next months ahead.
Thanks, Peter. I've got a question from the audience. So we've got about 10 minutes to go. So just going through some of these questions that are coming in. So linked to what you've been saying on sustainable procurement, there's a question from Kapila, who says, when you say a circular economy should also entail green or sustainable procurement, does that mean that we must ensure that these are recycled products and not virgin feedstocks?
So the answer, I guess, is no. I mean, I'm not being prescriptive about what we use. All I'm being prescriptive about is that we need to be more resource efficient. So we need to look at the resources that we use for a wind tower or a solar plant in equal ways to any other form of energy production. So we need to look at resources and resource efficiency and make sure that we are using them as efficiently as we can. We need to look at the life of the asset and obviously issues around the circular economy in terms of reuse, recycle, and all of the other issues, the 3 R's or the 4 R's, or some people talk about the 7 R's. So there are lots of things that we should be doing there. But the issue here is a lot more focus around that resource efficiency, commodity efficiency. I mean, you know, the fact of the matter is that, let me just take the food example. It's an obvious one, but we produce enough food in the world today to feed the world. The trouble is that 30% goes to waste. Well, does that make sense? The answer is no. So that's what I mean about resource efficiency. Equally, if we look at the hydrocarbons industry and we look at all the molecules that are produced, coal, oil, and gas, hydrocarbons out of the ground, less than 20% of those molecules actually turns into useful end-use energy. Does that make sense? No. So basically, if you begin to start looking at value chains in a different way, you come up with different solutions to the problem.
Great. Yeah, so I've got a question here which I'll put as an open question, so whoever would like to answer. It's around energy assets themselves. So how can we design energy assets to maximize their reuse potential? So any thoughts on that?
So I think, well, Peter, you know, might want to talk from an oil company perspective, but right now, I know that Shell and BP, etc., are looking increasingly at how they can make their assets more reusable. So you're beginning to see, you know, pumps, high pressure pumps that are being recycled. You're beginning to start seeing components within all industries increasingly looking at recyclability as an issue. And you're increasingly beginning to see, you know, even the Apples of this world saying, you know, it's ridiculous that we should be replacing our whole iPhone every year or two. You know, we should be actually upscaling as opposed to, you know, and reusing old equipment. So everybody's at it. As I say, the train has left the station, but everybody's kind of doing their own thing, and we need clearer rules of the game, which is up to, I guess, the Carbon Trust and people like yourselves to develop for us over the months ahead.
Thanks,
yeah, things which come to mind could be making separation of certain types of plastic easier in terms of labeling, because there's quite some facilities required to end up with the right types of plastic which are more easy to recycle than others. But in general, if you look at the challenge we set ourselves, there's not one golden bullet. You have to basically work all handles to realize that ambition, and also that means that in our facilities we're looking at retasking of processing units in a world where circular economy has a bigger place. I mentioned in the vegetable oil processing that can basically be done in hydrotreaters that become idle. So instead of demolition, you just reuse the machine as an example. Overall, there is still mileage to be made in energy efficiency in our production units, but also we think that carbon sequestration will have to play a role, certainly in the intermediate period, and that is also something which you need to do efficiently. It's a lot easier to collect the CO2 from one emission point in a concentrated way than from multiple emission points. So those are the things we are considering. But let's say biofuels plays a role, green hydrogen plays a role, recycling of plastics plays a role. Even the different types, gasification of the remaining, use that syngas chain as a building block for the future, because the beauty with a gasifier, it's quite robust in terms of what you can actually feed it. So there's quite a number of handles we're trying to touch in this space.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Just building on that, so we have a question here around circularity of carbon dioxide itself. So how can we utilize the CO2, and what are the main applications? Any thoughts on that?
One of the most important things if you go into CCU is the availability of green hydrogen. You need hydrogen to basically, let's say, call it open up your CO2. And doing that with hydrogen, which is not green, doesn't help you in the overall CO2 balance. Green hydrogen can be produced in multiple ways, from wind to solar, but maybe also from distributed geothermal systems. The different ways of producing that. Basically, the syngas chain can be used to make multiple products, and you can actually close the loop quite nicely if you have this abundance of green hydrogen available. The chemistry is known. It's a matter of that starting point.
Fantastic. Thank you. Seth, there's a question here for you. So we've talked a lot about collaboration and new partnerships. I think all of the speakers have been speaking about this. So the question is around how Infrastructure Asia, how are you guys working with the UK, and do you have any plans to further build a collaborative platform for both British and Singaporean businesses?
So we are here we are public service, so we do it. We are not for profit. We neither charge the supply side, which are companies, nor the demand side, which are the regional government counterparts. So how we work, I think, is we try to work with the best in class. So if you're good at what you're doing, in whichever field, if you're early stage consultant, let us know your strengths and also your focus. And then we can try to keep that in mind as we interact with the government officials. The topics that we are involved with is very much dependent on who are our collaborators on the supply side. We started with 12 in October 2018 when I first came back after being 15 years away. We have 12 partners. Now we have 500 over, which means that whoever works with us define what we can bring in terms of ideas and offerings to the regional government. So that's why originally it was very complex ideas like transit-oriented developments. So with that, fortunately, we have a UK company called Arup, which was very good in this space, and hence they journey with us to Indonesia, to West Java, to talk to the government officials about what are the possibilities the international private sector can bring. And as we venture now into the later stage, Stand Chart, which is half UK, they are now coming with ideas and also how to finance it from the bond side, from the bank side, even from the securitization side. So as and when, I think the most important thing, you must be good at what you're doing, and you must be interested in the region. And I think the third element is ideally you're already based in Singapore, or you have ambition to work out of Singapore. I emphasize that because it's not easy to look at a totally different region just sitting in the UK. I think you need to build up an ecosystem of partners, even in Singapore, to find buddies so that you can together attack opportunities together in the region, be it Indonesia or certain countries like Indonesia, which is a big market, or just across the region. I think you need partners, and that's why having a sub-office in Singapore does help. Yesterday, I was briefing the two central banks, UK as well as the Singapore, and I say how to attract you to come. I'll work on a series of opportunities, because it's only with a series of opportunities more and more UK companies will be willing to come to look at this region seriously and collaborate with us, because no one wants to work on a one-hit wonder anymore. With the miniaturization of infrastructure, now rooftop solar is also infrastructure. So you can't afford to spend half a year just doing a 30 megawatt rooftop. So ideally you want a series of opportunities. So if all these messages resonate with you, do reach out to us after this webinar, and we are happy to have a one-to-one discussions to understand where you want to focus on. And you'll be surprised, even in these times where it is not possible to travel, we are using digital bridges to discuss with regional governments, so we can get serious discussions on projects going on. So hopefully that creates another avenue of origination that supplement yours.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Seth. Appreciate it. I'm going to leave it there. So I think we've covered a lot of ground, some really great discussions. I won't go through the main points because there were so many, but fantastic to have you all here, and thank you very much for your time. I'm going to hand back to Tim to make some closing remarks and wrap up the session. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Will, and very well moderated. And on behalf of the two committees, Energy and Utilities and Sustainability, I think that was an excellent event. I'd like to say that this is the start of something, and thank you, Seth, for your offer of collaboration there. With BritCham itself, we've got events coming up. We have an event on future cities, which includes Arup and McDonald's and others, which were just mentioned. We've also got events coming up on hydrogen and another cross-committee event on waste to energy being planned later in the year. And there's many more events on the horizon. So I think this all ties in nicely with the BritCham, the road to net zero, and the lead up to COP26. So with that, I'd just like to, on behalf of everybody who's joined the webinar, thank all of the panelists, Seth, Peter, and Peter. We've brought people together from Europe and Singapore to look at this issue, and we've seen many perspectives, we've seen many opinions, and we've also seen many active case studies, and that's the spirit that we'd like to take things forwards. So the future events are up there on the screen. Please register for those. If you are a BritCham member anywhere in the world, you can participate in those. They'll also be up for replay, and we're seeing a lot of replay of our events as well. Earlier events on things like decarbonisation of shipping, having lots of replays, I noticed, so thank you for that. Finally, there is a chance for you to enter our business awards. The closing date is in August, so please apply for the business awards. And finally, our survey. So please complete the survey on this and give us your feedback. So with that, thank you once again to the speakers, and thank you to everyone who joined us. And that will close the webinar. Thank you.